Welcome to What Makes Good Writing in Spec Fiction and Games. So hopefully you are here for that. If not, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah, just nod your head that you are here and you do know that you're okay.
Right.
Perfect.
Awesome. So I think to get started, we'll introduce ourselves. So my name's Meg Eden-Kuyat. I am a creative writing instructor and longtime MAGFest panelist and fan. So I've got books. I mostly write from books perspective, but we'll also be talking about from game design perspective. We'll get into that a little bit later. But I've got books like Post High School Reality Quest about a girl in a text adventure, Good Different about a girl at a con, like MAGFest that learns to find her voice.
And my name is Lindsay Fritz. I am the author of Emma and the Queen of Featherstone. It releases in March. And it's about a girl who triggers a constructed portal to a hidden planet and her adventure to get home. I'm also the voice of Venturia in the indie game Dexter Stardust, Adventures in Space.
Awesome. So I think the best way to get started about talking about what makes good writing in games and books is to point out some of our favorite games and what made the writing so good. So do you want to start, Lindsay?
Yeah, so I cannot shut up about Stray. I think Stray is a phenomenal game. I think the point of view character for Stray is wonderful. I think the pacing of it too and how well written the storyline is through the puzzles also is phenomenal. Same with Dexter Stardust. I'm a little biased though because I do voice a character in it. So same thing, even though it's a point and click adventure game, it has nods to Monkey Island and a lot of different classics that I think are really phenomenal when it comes to storytelling as well. And I'm gonna put together Child of Light and Moss kind of combined because I love that they have like the storytelling element built into the system, and I think it kind of makes it fun. You can engage a little bit more with your character that way. As well as shout out to Portal 2. I love this game. It is so much fun, and it was a game that got me really back into playing games again. The gameplay in the system was phenomenal. I do think the storyline, I love AI. I love a human conscious being put into a robot. Phenomenal. As well as super hot. I think the VR version is really interesting with showing gameplay. And it's very simplistic, but it still has an interesting storyline to it, which you either love or hate. So.
Awesome. Just real quick, are you able to hear us well? Is volume good? Okay, awesome, thank you. So I love something that was coming up in what you were saying is this kind of marriage of storytelling through mechanics and gameplay, and I think that that's something really important that we should keep in mind as we talk about this. The best written games, it's not purely about the narrative or the writing, but how that's married with the mechanics so that we are viscerally experiencing this narrative and the feelings we're supposed to feel through games, which is what makes games so cool, right? We are not just passive readers, we are active participants in the narrative. And so if you look at the list of the games I have, there's kind of a mix of ones where the writing and the narrative is really what is being told to you through the game, like, Fire Emblem Three Houses. There's different branches, but there's kind of basic narratives of, if you're in Edelgard's house, there's going to be a certain narrative of events that's happening, versus games like Pokemon, which the narrative is very loose, right? Like, you are a trainer, you're going to beat these gym leaders, you're going to beat the Elite Four or whatever, but the narrative that's meaningful to you and the writing in that game is more of your personal narrative of like, I had my team with my Cyndaquil and there was this time where there was 1 HP against Miltank and I still beat it somehow despite rollout. Like that's kind of, my husband like cannot look at a Miltank without shivering in fear and trembling because of Whitney. But that's like what, if you love Pokemon, that's probably like the writing that's meaningful to you is the writing you are making and imposing when you're playing the game. So you'll see with these that there's a variety of that, but like with Fire Emblem Three Houses, I think when we're talking about like the marriage of the writing with the mechanics, I think what's so great is that, especially if you play multiple routes or any of these games with multiple routes, you build an affinity towards certain characters, and then if you play the other route, they're your enemies. enemies now, and you have to feel like, wow, is this okay? Or if you're like me and played the Edelgard route, there's some questionable decisions and some like, kind of radicalism that's happening there, and you have to go kind of like, how far do we go for a means to an end? So good writing in games makes you engage with larger questions. Earlier, a panel, we were talking about what remains of Edith Finch and suspense, if you guys were here at the suspense one. And I think what's so interesting about that game is all the unanswered questions it leaves. It's like a good book in that it allows for literary interpretation, that even years later, there's those of us going on Reddit being like, what do you think this death meant? Like, what really happened to Molly? Did she literally become a cat and then become a shark and roll down a hill? Probably not, but what does that mean? You know, how do we interpret that? And so I think when we have those little gaps in a narrative, that's going to really push us forward.
And this is just a fun video because I was really influenced by Stray.
And
If it'll play.
Yeah. Yay, tech issues.
All right.
it's a dream when I'm carrying your love with me.
No!
Let's try now. No!
It just gives more time to appreciate
Right,
the cute cat.
the cute kitties. All right, let me try it not full screen. Oh, come on. Hold up. Buffering.
And every day's a dream.
Nope. Well, just appreciate the cute kitties. It's a really short video.
Yeah, I'm surprised.
I'll be moving with the good
To throw back the towel.
Yeah, exactly.
carrying your love
So yeah, my kids made us get kitties. No, I don't want to play it again. Stop it. There we go.
Awesome. So, an important thing to talk about today is that, you know, the title says spec fiction and games, but those are obviously two very different mediums to talk about. So how do you think writing for games is similar to, you know, writing books, or how is it different?
Yeah, I really love the aspect of you have this avenue to tell stories. Like you brought out earlier, being able to tell a story and persuade someone to believe, you know, your narrative is super important, especially when you're writing speculative fiction, because you're creating an entirely new system that people have to learn as well as care about. So I think with both, like writing a novel and writing games, you have to take into consideration your audience and how you're writing. With creative writing, you have your words to be able to do that. But with gameplay, it's different. You have so many other mediums. You have sound, you have artistic aspects that you can kind of incorporate into your story that help you tell your story. That's why we have so much fun when we play games, because we are in it and we can visualize it. But also, same thing with a novel. You can picture it in your head, even though it's not in front of you, but the words are required to be there in order to create that picture. So I think there's a little bit of difference there, but they both are a fantastic avenue for creative writing and for utilizing that skill. And I think it's amazing to be able to write speculative fiction and to play games that are speculative.
Great. Yeah, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit later of some of the tools that we have as creative writers versus, writing for a game. But something that happened for me, so for my first book, it's told like a let's play, basically, of a girl playing a text adventure. So the narrative is, her putting inputs and the game, responding. So we thought what would be fun is to events like this, make a first chapter that was like a playable demo in kind of Action Castle-esque sort of way. And what was interesting about converting that is I thought, I've written the first chapter, that'll be easy to make into a game, right? No, you have to think about things differently. When I'm writing a book, I take for granted that, if I'm writing something interesting, if I'm following the rules of the story that I'm setting up, you will keep turning the page. With the game, I have to persuade you to make choices that will progress the narrative forward in a sneaky way. So obviously, I think most of us probably don't like the Navi kind of things that are like, oh, hey, listen, do this thing. We like to discover the thing or feel like it's our idea to do that thing, right? That's what makes games interesting. So when we were designing this, we were realizing that what I would take for granted as like, this is what makes sense to me that would happen next, and the choices I would make aren't necessarily true for what a player would be doing when they're going into the game. And so people, when we play tested it, would do all sorts of different things. And because it was a parser game, the input could be anything. So, people were inputting all sorts of options that we were like, oh, we didn't account for that. How do we improvise? So we had to think, how do we put little, like, breadcrumbs, trails and hints to show and gesture towards what will help progress the story forward while still making it that the player would put the pieces together themselves.
Trigger it.
Yeah.
Ooh, you just said a little bit about it.
Yeah. So, this is a little different, though we can touch on that too. So, we obviously love games, and we tend to write traditional narratives. But so, are there writing in games that have inspired your novels? Like, are there certain games where you're like, wow, the writing in this was so compelling that like it inspired you to write?
Yeah. So I think especially with my novel, I'm gonna say Child of Light, because I loved the writing in that game. It was phenomenal, and it pushed you forward because you wanted to like read the next, poetry that was in there to get to the next section. So I think the sort of whimsy that storyline created, I kind of wanted to have that in my novel, and I wanted it not to be so much as fantasy, but I wanted it to be more sci-fi. So I really wanted to have that blend of the whimsy that you felt like playing Child of Light to be in how you felt when you read Emma and the Queen of Featherstone. So I think that the writing in there is what kind of inspired this story, and writing the traditional novel of Emma and the Queen of Featherstone. But also too, I think the exploration, like No Man's Sky, because you have this freedom to kind of go anywhere you want to. And so I basically wanted that whimsy of like this storytelling, but combine it with the exploration of other planets. So I think that those two games really helped and kind of inspired the storyline for Emma and the Queen of Featherstone. And I think that's great because you can, when a story is so compelling, it also creates a vibe. Like you want to play it based, solely on vibe. Like, can I recreate that vibe that this had? Yes. And so I think that writing in games, especially the storytelling and the combination of everything, really did help with my novel writing, and it really inspired that aspect to be an explorer and to be able to have fun. And that's what you want to do. You want to look at things. You want to, see what this makes you want to do, what this storyline makes you want to do, or makes your character want to do. So I think that aspect of writing in games is very evident in my novel.
I love the idea of an aesthetic, or kind of like an aesthetic or mood inspiring your writing, because I hadn't really thought of it that way. And that actually, I I know what you mean. I was just reading middle grade called The Carrefour Curse. Gosh, Carrefour Curse. And it reminded me of Edith Finch. As I was reading it, I was like, this is like a book of Edith Finch, and it had kind of a lot more magic, but there was, if you like a game like Edith Finch with this kind of family history and a house and kind of something feeling wrong, it felt that the mood was there, and I just felt like I was in the Edith Finch house. For me, what I've taken away a lot of things from video games, but what I think is interesting is because they're a different medium, they have different tools at their disposal than we typically think of for writing for the page. So particularly when I started discovering like walking simulators, so like Edith Finch, Gone Home, these ones where there's objects and you're encountering those objects and they don't explain a lot to you explicitly, but you're putting pieces together of a narrative, that really started getting my gears turning with writing of like, how can I plant little things in my environment that do a lot of work? Especially when writing speculative fiction, I think one of the big challenges is you gotta explain this new world to people, but you don't want to bog down the progressive movement forward. Whether you're writing a book or even a campaign, you want that kind of balance of progression forward while giving enough of an introduction to a world. So through natural objects like we see in walking simulators and honestly other games too, like Dark Souls, there's a lot of objects you can encounter that tell you a lot about the lore, so you can slow down if you want to learn more, but if you're like, nah, I just want to like kill things and die, like you can do that too. So I've been trying to think of how can I use that economy of what little objects could go a long way of explaining a lot in a really small bit of space.
And I think with those objects too, especially when you're writing speculative fiction, they have to have some sort of anchor to reality that we can understand the concept of this item. Like in my novel, Emma the Queen of Featherstone, there's new tech that's on this new planet, and it has to have some basis for someone who's reading or playing a game to understand it. And the great thing about with games, you kind of have the artistic direction that you can kind of gauge, like, okay, this is how I use this sort of a blaster, or this is how I can utilize this sort of tech in this world. So it is important when considering something that is speculative, that is sci-fi, that is fantasy, that it has that sort of anchor to reality so that people can connect with it and have that ability for ease of use.
I love that. Yeah, great point. So an aspect that's going to be in both games and books is character development. So how does character development compare and contrast in novel writing and video games? What's similar and what's different?
I think that, I think it's very interesting creating that character development through either first person or third person. I think it depends. Like both a novel and games can utilize these aspects. I think it's a little bit harder. It might just be me too, though, with third person writing.
Could you unpack just a little bit of what those mean?
Like when you're writing in first person, it's like you are the one who's in the actions, versus third person is you're utilizing and viewing other people who are actually having those actions. So whenever you have gameplay that has something like that, either first person or third person, you're gonna need the character development, and it's just different tools that you're utilizing if you're writing in something that's first person versus third person. Because like with first person, you are engaging with all of the objects. Like you are the one who has the narrative. Third person is you are viewing other people who are actually having these conversations. You are the ones that they are having the conversations, and so it's going to vary depending on your writing style for the game and versus traditional novel writing. But I think that both of them can be easy or hard depending on how you attack it.
Yes, they have pros and cons.
Yes.
And actually, I wanted to add in there the second person that we never talk about, because I did that for this, and if you played any text adventures, it's in second person, right? Like you are in a village, there's a fishing pole, exits are left, and second person I think is a really interesting tool. It's there's times where it works, you kind of have to be careful with it, but it's an interesting bridge between the two, because the person, the you, like the one speaking about you, they have some some level of intimacy. They know the you to some degree, but there's also some of that distance of third person. So you kind of get a middle ground. But the reason it works or doesn't work is when we're being told who we are and what we do, sometimes we go, I wouldn't do that. That's not me. For some reason, we react more to being told you are this versus I am, where maybe we can acknowledge we're in the head of this character, but the you is so intimate that it's like we can't divide ourselves from it.
Yeah, and I really wanted to bring out Stray because I love it. But the use environment and dialogue is interesting because obviously you're a cat, so you're not talking. But like right in the very beginning of the story, you're this cat, you're with your cat friends, and suddenly you lose them. I cannot tell you how sad my 4-year-old was after watching that. So you can use just the environment and the surrounding characters to make a very compelling story just from like 2 seconds of gameplay.
Yes, because I think when we were talking about this before, we were talking about building empathy.
Yes.
And so games are so unique in that we are viscerally interacting with them, so we're going to feel something. We can feel so much from a book too, but there's something unique about the empathy we feel in a game. And again, I'm thinking of Fire Emblem Three Houses, or really a lot of the Fire Emblem games where the mechanics are the most compelling part of the character development to me, because they are your squad, they're your soldiers, right? And you're on the battlefield together, and who dies, especially if you're playing permadeath, the stakes of losing a comrade, or the memories that you have of, a critical hit in such a critical moment with a character that you'd least expect, like you're gonna feel connections with those characters because of the journey you've gone on with them.
Yeah, that's very true.
And so this is where I'd love to dive a little deeper into some specific, we've kind of touched on a lot of these elements, but digging a little deeper into what elements of storytelling can we use of whatever story we're telling, whether this is in games or books. So what are some elements of good storytelling? And in the next slide, we'll talk about ones for games versus books, but maybe starting, did you want to talk about a couple of these big picture elements?
Yeah. So I think a lot that we are told, especially as authors, is the show don't tell.
Yes.
We are constantly told that all the time, that you should be showing and not telling someone. Because it's brought out, you don't want to be told what's happening to you or to the story. You want to experience it. You want to see it. So one of those aspects is when you have mechanics, you want to keep it simplistic enough to where you're showing the right point and the right point of view that you want to have. And I also want to touch on the narrative aspect. Sometimes with writing, you do have to have that, you do have to tell a little bit.
Yes.
There are some aspects where you might have to tell, but one of the avenues that can be used when you have like an act or a section of the story that you need to explain a little bit more, you can use the come in late and leave early feature. You can actually start the act or the scene right in the middle of it. That way it creates the impetus to go forward, to continue, and you want to see like, okay, why are they there right now? Like, what is going on? What is happening? I love in Dexter Stardust, there's this scene where you jump in and the two main characters, Dexter and Aurora, they're like tied to a tree, and you're like, wait a second, why are they there? And it wants you to continue on. It wants you to continue to get them free. And I think that's really interesting because they do actually have a lot of talking in that scene, and where they're talking about what's going on the planet, and but because they utilize that aspect of coming in late and leaving early, it actually makes it where you still want to play it, even though there's a little bit more telling than showing.
I wanted to add on that real quick a couple things. I've heard people even say for game design, like, do more, tell less, because like you say, it's not completely show, never tell. Like, there is some telling involved, but the more that we are actively participating or being shown as opposed to being told, oh hey, you should go right over there, like that's lazy tutorials in games, right? Where the smart ones, it's mechanically designed, so we go, oh, like you think about like Mario, right? Like you move right because the screen ends here. So that like just that design tells us something of, I probably shouldn't go this way. I should probably go this way. And what you were talking about, like in medias res, of like starting in the middle of action. Tomorrow I've got a talk on first lines or openings, and how do we make that strong? And that's one of the things I talk about, is getting us into the middle of the action and then slowly giving us what information we need absolutely when we need it, and asking good questions. Because when we're like the one you were giving of Dexter, it's like we're asking like, well, what's going on? And then that makes us want to move forward and play and learn. So
yeah, and I also think Super Hot, the VR version, is a really good example of that too, because it literally has one-word prompts that are in front of you when you're using it, and you're using your body to be able to work it, and even then it's the simplest way, but because of how you're moving your body and how it reacts, it's teaching you just through that, even through like one-word command.
Awesome. So here are some tools that, maybe we share between traditional storytelling and games. So we've talked about show, don't tell, and that environmental storytelling. And I say no Navi because, I think when we're being told explicitly, that's less compelling. And I know I just press A or whatever to get through that. But another thing to think about is stakes. So for those of us with it being published, we've been told by our editors, what are the stakes? People are going to read if they know, like, what's going to be lost. And so for games specifically, that's like, well, why should I play? Like, why should I care? And also I think what's interesting is thinking about losing, because that's a unique state for games, right? Like for us, when we're writing a book, we're thinking, well, what does the character got to lose? And that's pushing us forward. But when we're playing, what do we have to lose? And what is the game telling us about losing? So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking it's really interesting because games have a lot of different ways of talking about loss and teaching us about loss. So you think of EVE Online, you die, you lose everything, you literally have to start over. That's high stakes whenever you do anything. You build that up and you really feel the terror. Or similarly, Fire Emblem permadeath, right? Like you're gonna lose that comrade and you're never gonna get them back. Versus think about Celeste, where they encourage you to lose. They say losing is learning. And so instead of making you feel panic, they want you to do the exact opposite of enjoy the game, learn and accept loss. So I think that's an interesting, unique tool we've got. Do you want to say anything about world building or any of that stuff so far? Yeah,
definitely. We kind of touched on it with regards to logic, because everything, especially when you're playing a game, it has to make sense what you're doing. And even with traditional storytelling, that also has to make sense. You have to be able to understand what's going on, especially with speculative fiction. You definitely have to make sure that the world building is believable, because otherwise people will be like, I don't care. Like, I don't want to be playing this anymore 5 minutes in, or I don't want to be reading this book. Trash. Right. So definitely, like you said, the flow of ideas, believability, you want to make sure that everything that you're writing into it has that sort of connection to the real world, or will impel someone to continue reading or continue being part of that world. Because you as the creator, you can build your world however you want, but if nobody wants to be in it, it's not very impactful. So definitely having that logic and that flow of ideas is something that you need to build in when you are thinking about writing your narrative with games or with a traditional novel.
Well, we talked earlier a little bit about good questions, right? At the beginning of Dexter, like, well, why are they here? What's going on? But there's bad questions too, right? Of like, well, what the heck is the cell phone doing in a book set in the 60s? Like that doesn't make sense. So even for traditional writing, if it's spelled wrong, that can throw us out of the dream of like, wait, isn't that spelled this way? So when whatever kind of story we're telling, we want our participant, whether that's a player or reader, to ask good questions that make them want to learn more, not bad questions of, wait, this doesn't make sense. Or sometimes the problem I'll have with stories is that I'm asking too many questions all at once. And then it's like, I can't keep track of anything. I'm just like, what the heck is going on? So good questions, not bad questions. That's why I said in the dream. When I'm playing a game or when I'm reading, I feel like I'm in a dream state, right? And when I'm enjoying that, I'm moving forward. But if something wakes me from the dream, that's not good.
Yeah, it takes you out of place and you just don't want to continue. Yeah. You're just like, I'm done. And I do think it's really interesting talking about that the character aspect of having complexity and something that you can connect with, because who doesn't love a good bad guy, a good villain?
Yeah.
You know, someone who you can connect with even if they're being evil. So I think that's something too that is very important, whether you're telling, you know, a game story or if you're telling a regular novel. Definitely important to be able to keep the character like it's connectable.
Yes, and I say they're not the Dark Pictures anthologies, so anyone familiar? Oh, I heard a yes. So I was particularly burned by Little Hope. Thank you. I was engaged by that concept. We're going to this creepy old, like, Massachusetts witch-burning historic town, and we're exploring, and there's, like, creepy crap going on, and I'm like, yes. But the characters were so obnoxious, and for a Telltale game, a Dark Pictures anthology game, it is all about the characters, right? Gosh, what's the first one? Why do I always forget what's called?
Until Dawn.
Until Dawn, thank you. So, right, like, all those, you know, you're switching between different characters and you're playing in an environment and you're making choices based on which character you're playing. If I think everyone's a jerk and they should die, like, why am I feeling invested in saving their lives when that's literally the whole point? And if you want to hear more about that, I rambled on the Mage's vlog about that. So, yeah, you want characters, and that, I think the mistake they're making is they're thinking like flawed characters are good, but then they're only doing flaws, right? And you know, people have that criticism of Life is Strange, right? Chloe, especially in the later games, some people are like, oh, she's just only unlikable. So I think we can have a risk of going too far in the meter, but a good complex character is just human, right? Like, they do some stuff that's likable, they do some stuff that's not so great, and we should have a little bit of both that make us want those characters to live and not die, right? Or I guess maybe if you hate them so much, maybe that can be a motivator too, but
just die already.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but in games and in books, we have a lot of tools to do that too, and I think we often forget the power of dialogue and monologue. And again, not them telling us everything of, hey, remember, hey, sister of mine who has lived at my house for 6 years, remember that time you did this? But we can be smart with dialogue and with these tools.
Dumping.
Right, exactly. Info dumping is the easy way out, and it's not effective.
Exactly.
Oh, and I put on there, I don't have this in this talk, but if you look at Doug Sharp's interactive fiction blog post, if you search for that, he has a really interesting diagram of the tools we have, particularly for interactive fiction, but we can apply that for games too, of, you know, what is interactive versus what are we telling that's static. So I recommend checking out that blog post if you're interested. Do you want me to start with this one, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Awesome, okay. So here are some tools unique to gaming. So we kind of talked about ones we could share with both. Here are some that, you know, are specific to games, and I talked about guiding and directing the player when I learned that the hard way. So you have to think about when you're writing in a game, how are you gonna, you know, direct your player? And when you have to think about those stakes again too, of specifically how they're meaningful, not just to the character you're playing, but to you. And I think a lot of games make this mistake. Is that a hand or are you stretching?
I'm stretching.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. We definitely, if people have questions, stuff, we want to make sure to address that. So a thing that games I've been seeing is a lazy shorthand recently. I'm playing the new Rabbids game. Is anybody playing that too? No? Oh, okay. But anyway, it's kind of a tactical game, and it makes the mistake of making this whole story about how there's this dark crystal thing in the world that's ruining everything. And I'm like, dude, I'm just playing because I want to play a tactical strategy game. Like, I don't care about the universe. And similarly, like Zelda, are we really playing it necessarily for Hyrule? We're probably playing it because we want to explore and be an adventurer and we want to be the hero. And so I think games sometimes make the mistake of putting so much emphasis on the narrative when really the mechanics are why we're there. We're picking up an adventure game because we want to play an adventure game as opposed to what the game is telling us to care about. And the mechanics are going to be the most compelling more than the content there.
Yeah, and it can be kind of hard to balance that out, especially if you're trying to figure out gameplay. To balance that with having a narrative that feels like it is leading to something that makes people want to play it, like that can be really difficult for a lot of people. But making sure that that the narrative is something that can direct this gameplay, and to make sure that people are exploring the way that the game is made to, be explored.
I love that. Whatever story we're telling, we want to make sure it's in the right medium, right? So we shouldn't force that into a game just because, I want to make a game. It should be that those mechanics and player interactivity and choices make the story, right? It couldn't be told any other way. If I'm writing a book, that really needs to be the medium for the story. And so we talked about kind of this, actually, I don't know if we talked about this. There's a contract whenever we're playing or reading, right? There's a contract between the reader and the book. There's a contract between the player and the game, right?
Yes.
And so you talked about logic a little bit, but we want that fairness and engagement that we're saying, like, I will keep playing if the game plays fairly. I will keep reading if the book makes sense. And especially with gameplay feeling fair, if you feel like the game is ripping you off, if the game's not playing fairly, that's the main reason I'll rage quit, right? Like, I'm just gonna be like, screw this. And I actually had an example for anybody that does campaigns. One thing we learned, my husband does Pathfinder campaigns, and he had a campaign where there was, it was gonna be in the desert, and so there could be storm damage from like sandstorms, right? And he didn't want to explicitly tell that to people, but he wasn't quite sure how to put that in, and so he didn't make it very clear to the players that if they traveled in the day, they would get this damage. And so he was like, are you sure you want to do that? And they said, sure, because they didn't know, right? And then they go in the desert, and he's like, damage. And they were all like, what the heck? You didn't tell us that rule. And so we realized, like, if we were going to do that campaign again, we would figure out a way through the environmental storytelling. Maybe you talk to somebody, and they say, ooh, maybe you should be careful about traveling at this time. Or, maybe we overlook and we see someone getting that damage. So we can learn somehow through the environment the rules of the game so we don't feel cheated by the game. Have you ever felt cheated by a game?
A lot of people here might be cheated, but I use it as a game that I like was Super Hot. But the interesting aspect of that is that a lot of people, once you got through it, did not like the ending of it, and I completely understand and agree with that. Even if you have really good dynamic in the game, really good gameplay, you can build this character that you are, and then suddenly you're just dead, or you have to keep doing this till you die over and over again.
Right.
And I think it can be either really good or really bad, depending on who you talk to and who plays it. But I do think it's all about balancing those characters, especially when you are creating characters for a game. You want to feel something for them, and you want to be able to play them in that logical way that's not going to suddenly be like, okay, well, you're dead, bye. Right.
Well, and something that you were talking about was making me think also, you want to know who your audience is of what they are wanting from a game. So, if they want Nintendo hard, and that's your audience, obviously making things that feel really hard is fine, but if you're trying to get more of the casual player market, making it Nintendo hard is going to feel unfair, right? And that's not what they're playing a game for. Similarly, I think a panel we were talking about this, and somebody was bringing up D&D and how, in certain versions it's more challenging, right? And you lose your characters, and how that can be, like, what do we do with that? Especially if D&D is becoming more popular and mainstream now, and people are really doing it as a community, especially post-COVID, right? Like, I know so many people who survived COVID because they had their D&D friend group, and that was like, this is my social stuff. So, like, in that context where the main goal is social community, do we really want a really hard thing? Like, that's not necessarily the point and function of the game. So you want to be thinking about who your audience is and what they want.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I'm not clear what that first bullet is.
Oh, sorry. So in a game, you're having to guide and direct that player. So when I'm writing a book, I'm kind of, it's a binary choice, right? They will turn the page or they will not turn the page, right? And I am leading the whole narrative, and I'm kind of like more or less assuming and hoping you'll turn the page.
Does that stand for something? The PH?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So that's this book. So were you hearing about the first chapter demo?
Got it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, sorry. That was shorthand for me that I copied in and forgot to take out.
But yeah, that's really important. Like with the first chapter and figuring out how to direct someone is very, very different from directing someone in gameplay. Like that's something that it's so important because you have to understand gameplay. First of all, it can't be just like thrown out there. You have to actually understand how you're going to be playing the game, which goes into the narrative with games. It has to direct you the right way.
Well, I love that too, they stretch different muscles, right? When I'm writing a book or a poem, I'm thinking in a different way than if I'm trying to write like a text adventure. So I encourage you, if you enjoy storytelling, to try different mediums, they're going to work different muscles and it's going to only strengthen the main way that you write. Yes.
Is there a specific, name to the transition of taking something from a novel to a game type script? Like, as if you were going to go to a movie, you would write it in a script, like screenplay. Is there a name for that for like transitioning into gaming?
So the question is there a word for transitioning like a game into a different kind of medium or property? Like
A book into.
Okay.
Go from a novel to like a movie is a script or screenplay, but going from a novel to a game.
Like writing gameplay narrative.
That's a good question.
Well, I think if you're just a game writer, like that's your actual title when you start writing a game. There's not an official, I don't think there's an official term.
Yeah, I don't think there's.
Yeah.
Oh, what did you say?
I've heard it called just scripts before.
Okay, you've heard it called scripts before. Yeah, I would just think that it would be like based on the book or something like that, because it would change quite significantly. Like a novelization or something like that maybe would be less radical of a change versus a novel going into a game.
Yeah. But like most people who are writing for games, they just call themselves game writers. So
yeah, does that answer your
really
question?
boring. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So do we have more slides before we want to open to questions? Because we're getting about
let me
that
see.
time.
Oh no, I just have the video.
Okay.
All right. So do you want me to put the video?
Let's maybe make sure we address questions, and then we've got time.
Yep.
We're hitting about the question time. So does anybody else have questions? Things we didn't talk about, or things that you want to talk about more? Yes.
One thing that I've noticed is that sometimes when there's sequels to games, like narrative-wise it can continue, but the gameplay part of narrative sometimes resets. Like your character goes from throughout the journey, the narrative arc of game 1, they go from maybe a basic person to hero, but in game 2 they have to restart from the beginning. Gameplay-wise, the narrative might be, the narrative will keep expanding their character growth. So how do you balance the narrative story continuing on, but the gameplay sort of resetting?
So the question was about how in sequels of games, the narrative can be progressing forward, but the gameplay kind of restarts, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think when you have a game, a lot of times a developer, when they are starting with the second game, it's because they realized that the game needed something, or they got feedback that the gameplay needed to change a little bit. So they might add on the similar narrative so that whoever might be just coming and playing the second game might actually still be introduced to the world. It's kind of similar when you're writing a second book in a series. You might want to add in something that can continue the narrative or remind people who haven't played the first game or read the first book. So you don't have to be you don't have to have so much narration with the second novel, or a second gameplay. You want to make sure that you still hint at what was in the original, though, because obviously you have people who are just picking up a second game, and it might have different gameplay just based on feedback that the developer had from the previous game.
Yeah, I think Lindsay brings up a really great point of the challenge, right? You potentially have new people playing, and so how do you figure out what they're going to be able to learn in that time? And so I guess my response would be thinking about what do you want that second game to do? Is it that you're what is your goal? Is it that you really want the gameplay to be added up a challenge, and maybe so then you have some time for the player to acclimate, but then you mostly make it more difficult than the first one? Or is the narrative more valuable? There's probably one that's, they're both there and they're both important and they both need to be married, but there's probably one that's a little bit more prominent in what's driving you creating the game. And so I would think it's okay that, you give precedence to one based on what goal you have of what you're trying to produce and create. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Right behind, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you guys for doing this panel. It's really great.
Oh, yay, thank you.
I'm a professional editor.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a professional editor. I've worked almost exclusively in nonfiction up to now, but I just got a proposal for a fantasy novel, and I was wondering if you guys had any advice for editors new to editing fiction.
Ooh, that's a great question. Do you have any thoughts?
Keep in mind the voice of the author. That's really important, I think, with editing. I think sometimes, the question was someone who is editing nonfiction, branching out into editing fiction, what they have to keep in mind. And again, a lot of times when writing fiction, it is all about the voice and the way you are telling something. And a lot of times I think what editors forget is that voice when you're just trying to fix storytelling or fix the plot. Sometimes you tend to remove the voice from it. So I think it's really important to keep in mind the author who is writing and their own personal voice that they are bringing to the story. You liked the story that much, maintain that. Make sure that that voice is still there.
I love that. Yeah, and I'd recommend, reading speculative fiction that you love, or just going on your shelf, finding ones you love, and what makes it compelling, and thinking about that as you're editing it to try to emulate those similar things. If it's really long, and maybe how do we tighten this so that the plot's really solid and moving forward. Just, I find that reflecting on what I love and what works well about that often is my best teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great question. Yes.
So you were focusing on earlier about the difference between character-driven and plot-driven. Like for Legend of Zelda, you don't play the same time where you say you play with Link and you're invested in his story, as opposed to other games where you're trying to save the world, I guess. But I feel like it's less of a problem in books because you're usually focusing on characters, especially in first-person POV, because you're so attached to the person, so you're focused on them, not really the overarching world. Do you think it's a problem focusing on character versus plot in books more than video games?
So there's a great question of, is there a problem of focusing on character versus plot in games, did you say, or books? In books. Yeah. Did you have anything you want to say first?
So we continue and then
No, you're good. I couldn't tell if you were about to say something, so I wanted to respect that.
It's okay.
So it's really interesting what you said, and I think that there's a couple things. So like you said with games, there's different genres, right? And so it's the same with books, that there's going to be certain genres that are going to be more focused on the character-driven versus the plot-driven. As people who are working with editors, we will hear way more about, at least, okay, maybe you could tell me if this applies to you too, but I'm often told I need more of the plot. And often somebody will have one or the other. Like if they're really plot-driven, their editor's probably like, you need to do a little bit more with character. Did you get anything similar with that?
I actually got the opposite. I was told I needed a little bit more of the setting.
Oh, okay.
Because of being speculative. And so that's, the great thing about having an editor, someone who can kind of tell you, this is more character driven or this is more plot driven, focus on this, this is what you're good at, so go with it. Yes. Normally you'll have beta testers in games that will tell you this is good or this is bad. I happen to know that Dexter Stardust had a complete rewrite from the original gameplay because of beta testing and because of feedback that they got in order to go through their gameplay and their storyline. Even they changed the entire narrative. So it's one of those things that you'll get feedback from those things, and you'll hear what your strengths are versus what aren't your strengths, especially with a novel or with writing a game.
Well, and I think depending on the market you're doing too. So we do kidlit, so middle grade and young adult, and in those they're really like plot. And so I tend to be very character driven. So often my agent is like, well, what's the stake? What's really going on? And so that's where I have to kind of get pushed to have a little bit more of a balance. Versus if you're doing like adult literary, like they don't care as much about the plot typically, and it's a lot more about the character. So it does depend on what you're trying to write for whom, but usually I'd say it's probably like you want to try and have a good balance of both. Does that answer your question? Okay, awesome. Yes?
Do you guys feel that, I guess like when you write a novel, the narrator is its own character in a way. or the narration is, do you feel like that usually gets cut out when it goes into the game for the environment and mechanics of it? 'Cause I haven't seen a lot of like, you don't see games narrated often. You see them like go through their environment that they're in.
So,
No, go for it.
so the question is about narrators in games versus books, and like if it's in a game, do you find that cut out? And I find your question interesting because Stanley Parable is a game that really stuck out to me because of its narrator, narrating what we're doing, and that was what inspired me to write my book, because I was like, the narrator, and that's a character, right? That you can, and conflict is created by if you oppose what that character's telling. So I think for games and books, you can have a narrator or you can't. It's really just depending on what you're trying to tell and what's purposeful and necessary. We talked a little bit about Edith Finch earlier, and Unfinished Swan comes to mind too, where there is kind of a narrator presence in various times in the game. And Edith Finch is interesting because the narrator varies based on the death in the story. So you get a lot of options of what point of views are possible and what a narrator can do. What were you thinking?
And I think too, especially when you're talking about narrative for games, you want someone to continue playing the game. So you don't want them to be so stuck in the narration that they get bored. And I think that's the thing where there's a little bit of a difference between novel writing and writing a game, is that you can very quickly in gameplay get bored with narration because you're just sitting there and you're just reading and you just want to kind of like click through whatever, like this isn't important. So I think it's like I think you said, like a balance between making sure that you have enough information for the world building and the narration, but not too much to the point where you want to stop playing.
Yeah.
That's a big point.
Well, and the tools you use for narration too. So when you were saying that, it made me think of like Gone Home, where there's not narration, but there's the voice messages, like you find the tapes of the character, and that functions somewhat as a narrator. So games, it's cool because there's so many different tools you can do to implement that kind of exposition. And so you can really be creative of what will best fit the story I'm trying to tell, what will best interact with the gameplay. So I love ones like Gone Home, where, that's going on, but you can still keep wandering around. So it's not impeding gameplay, and I think that's really great. So I would think for you of like, what do I want to happen? Does it need a narrator, or where can I fit in creatively, naturally in that world?
Yeah, and that's actually what I liked about Stray too, because there is a lot of that. Like if you're walking around, you're this cat, and you see on the clocks they all say 16 hours, like, and there's no direct explanation behind that, other than when you're exploring the world, you find the poster that says, why time is so long for 1 day period. So you can utilize something like that only if maybe they're exploring, or if you want to create more of the story, but it's hidden in that way where you have to search for it and you have to find it in order to help your story or explain a certain aspect of your story.
When they give you exactly what you need to know at that moment.
yeah.
So however you're telling your player of what they need, what do they need to know in that moment so that they have just enough grounding to answer the questions that they have.
Exactly.
Yeah, real quick, yeah.
So, I'll offer myself. I just, were the games that you mentioned, my goal is to adapt something that I'm writing into a game.
Awesome.
The games that you mentioned, were they novels and then adapted into games?
So he's asking about if novels adapted into games, if there's examples of that. I wish we had one of my friends here who actually did that, where he wrote a novel and he converted some of it to a VR game because he could speak to that Luke Johnson, if you look him up. But do you know of any examples of that?
I actually don't.
Okay.
Like even from the aspect, I was trying to think of Dexter Stardust, but no, it didn't start off as a novel. It was just straight gameplay.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's relatively unusual, so I don't know of examples.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Oh, I know of one. The soccer games are a series of books called Roadside Picnic. And they're like this kind of like really cosmic horror sci-fi. These are more of a first-person shooter, so it's not quite the one, but that's a book adapted into a game.
Could you say that title again?
Stalker.
The
Stalker.
soccer games?
Okay.
Witcher.
Oh, Witcher. Oh, good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In the same vein, the Metro series was written by Dmitry Bukovsky, who a bunch of the soccer devs left GSC and went and made that game.
Okay, yes, right here.
Did we? Did the question get repeated? Did you get the information?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Great, yes.
I was wondering if you had any opinions about like themes that are best suited for games versus books, because it feels like there are some that it's like, oh, that game should have been a book, or that, you know, other things that maybe are too bleak for games or too like happy, or you want to see them in a game. Like, what's your kind of opinion on that?
So the question is about themes that are appropriate for games versus books, if there's things that are too bleak for one or the other. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, we've talked about audience, so it really depends on, you know, who the intended audience is for. You know, there's a wide range of both mediums, so I really think it's going to be what you want to do, because that's what you're going to be passionate about, and that's what you're going to get involved in, because there is obviously an audience for a lot of different themes. So I don't really think everything is like off limits, but I think it depends on who the intended audience is.
Yes, I would agree, and I would think more in what can games do for you versus books as mediums with the theme, because obviously, as we've said, there's the interactivity versus, you know, a flat or like a static narrative, right? So if the theme is something you want people to engage in a specific way, that may tell you if it should be a game or a book.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you brought up the Stanley Parable earlier. There's trends and various games that have like you breaking the narrator breaking the fourth wall, but sometimes they're commenting or joking about like, this is a really difficult level. And there are other games that are actually making that as a part of the game itself, the Stanley Parable. So where do you feel like, is there a line between appropriateness for breaking the fourth wall for the game and like in that world?
So the question is about breaking the fourth wall in games. So like Stanley Parable, is it a level of appropriateness of how far you can go with that? Is that accurately represented?
Essentially, like, the purpose of it is like, do you feel that there's an actual like rules governing that for your own like, world building?
The purpose of breaking the fourth wall. Okay.
I think that really plays into the logic aspect. Like, does it make sense to be doing it, and with how frequently? Does it add anything to your narrative? Does it add, you know, a certain depth to it? That is something that you kind of have to ask yourself when you're writing it and creating it, because obviously people who are going to be playing it or reading your book are going to be asking the same question. So I think you kind of know through, like I brought out earlier with like beta testing, and that you know what is too much of breaking the fourth wall versus maybe scaling it back a little bit so that it feels a little bit more immersive.
Yes. This may be kind of repeating what you just said to some degree, but when we were talking about, I was thinking about Deadpool versus She-Hulk in the cinematic universe. So we're not talking about the comics, but okay, so like Deadpool, they really utilized the breaking the fourth wall cleverly, right? She-Hulk, they were like, hey, the comics did this, you need to do this. And most people have kind of seemed to feel like that was really kind of tacked on. So like any tool, it should be used purposefully. You should be like, there has to be fourth wall. Like if you were in a meeting having to propose why you should be doing that, you should be able to have a good answer as opposed to like, I don't know, might be fun. Like the game should really need it.
Yeah.
So we are down to the last few minutes, so I just wanted to say there's more questions. I'm happy to stay afterwards.
I can stay after a little bit too.
So please feel free to come up, talk to us if we don't get to your question. We'd love to talk to you more, and we also are happy to give you swag about our books too.
And also the first 5 people up here who chat get a Steam code to Dexter Stardust, so if you want that.
There you go. Awesome. I think I saw a couple hands, so we can maybe answer one more question. Yes.
So, I really enjoy the writing of, you might have heard the studio From Software, with their style of writing, Soulborn, and so on and so forth. I wanted to ask, what do you think brought in such success on how they write their stories, lore, world building, so on and so forth?
So the question is about from Software, right?
From Software and the writing style.
And the writing style.
What brought success? What do you think brought success?
I am not personally familiar with playing From styles.
I'm not either.
Or From studios. Yeah.
What do you think makes
do you have any thoughts on the...
So I'm just going off of what I heard. I've asked this question to a few other people. This is the answers I've gotten. The first answer I received that caught my attention was they used the method of the mystery box. Basically, we get one piece of information, and that leads to another information, which brings up other information and opens up the world for us. So that's one answer I got. The other answer I also received was that Miyazaki, the lead developer of FromSoft Soulborn games, was that he was inspired by, he read books and he was inspired by the mysteries that those books left and questions that left him to answer with the rest of his community. I don't know which one community, but I just know that he's been asking that. And he was inspired by that and replicate that. So that was another answer I got,
And I do think that's really interesting because one of the things, especially when you have any sort of passion project, if you have a novel you're writing or if you have a game that you're developing, people can see that you care about your work. So I think one of the main things that it sounds like from what you're saying is that the creator is actually cares about the work and cares how people feel about the work. And for things that are truly successful, you can tell as a player, as a reader, that is something that is very important to be able to maintain players and to be able to maintain a readership.
Great point, well said. So we are at 2:30. Thank you so much for being here.